CHAPTER 16 of Julia Ried. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 16, in which I have but one voice. The festival was a success without either ring cake or grab bag, for the opposition to the latter had proved to be so marked that it, too, was discarded, though the curious silk bag was sold by ticket in a kind of genteel private way. During the whirl of preparation many of my accustomed duties had been neglected, among others my regular Thursday letter to mother. For 3 weeks I had not written a line to her, and I comforted myself with the thought that when this festival was over I should have plenty of time for that, and a great variety of other neglected matters. But no sooner had we calmed down from the excitement of our own festival, when we became eager over one that was to take place in a village a short distance from Newton. Mrs. Tyndall had a niece living there who was deeply interested in the affair, and Mrs. Tyndall's last brilliant idea was that a few of us should go out there and repeat for them our most successful tableaux. I entered into the scheme with great glee. Indeed, I had reached such a pitch of excitement that I seemed to have lost what little common sense I ever possessed. But some of the girls demurred. Lycia Simons, when appealed to, answered promptly and with some hauteur that she was not a professional performer and did not hire out by the night. At which Mrs. Tyndall composedly laughed, and remarked as we left the corner where our conference had been held, "Poor Lycia will never forgive Jerome for not inviting her into the Turkish tableau, nor me for not directing him to do so. She has been spiteful ever since." "Is that the trouble?" I asked, with wide open eyes, and she laughed as she answered, "Why, yes, you innocent mouse. You seem to have no idea that you are the envy of most of the young ladies in our set." Now I had not during all this time remained ignorant of the fact that Mr. Sayles was a general favorite. He was cultured and courteous, and had the air of a finished gentleman. He was reputed wealthy, both in reality and in prospect, being the expected heir of a wealthy uncle. Nor had I been at all unconscious of the fact, that while he might apparently have had but to choose his society from any family in town, his preference for me had become so marked and decided that it was a subject of general interest among our mutual acquaintances. I felt immensely flattered and grateful, and those very feelings led me into making some sad blunders. Well, concerning the festival, there were others who were of the same mind as Lycia Simons. Among them little Ruth Walker, though her mind was not expressed in the same manner, but simply and gently, that "mother would rather she did not go;" and Mrs. Tyndall's assurance that it should "not cost her a cent if that were the difficulty in the way," only had the effect of bringing a very becoming pink flush to her pretty face, and of giving perhaps a little more decided ring to her voice as she repeated her refusal. But there were others quite as eager for excitement as myself, who hailed the proposition with glee, and we made up a company of 7, and planned and rehearsed and frolicked away another week of time. In the meantime that unwritten letter to my mother lay heavy on my conscience, but my preparations had all to be made after working hours in the shop were over, and they left me very little chance even to think. One thing I carefully did, I avoided all tete-a-tetes with Dr. Douglass, though I could hardly have told why. At least I did not answer the question even to myself. It was the afternoon before the festival. I had been excused from the shop in order to finish my preparations. We were to take the 6 o'clock train, and expected to return on the 2 o'clock express. Dr. Douglass had hardly been present at table during the week. He was unusually pressed with professional cares. When he was present, there seemed to be a tacit understanding that our proposed trip was not to be discussed, at least the subject was not mentioned. As we arose from dinner on this particular day, the doctor turned suddenly to me. "Julia, can you give me 10 minutes of your time? I have a message for you." And without waiting for my reply, he at once led the way to the library, and closed the door after us. Then immediately he said, "Julia, are you going on that singular expedition tonight?" Dr. Douglass was not wise in his commencement. To address a girl of 16, especially one as devoid of sense as I seem at that time to have been, in a kind of horrified tone about something that she had fully made up her mind to do, is nearly certain to exasperate her. Accordingly, I was exasperated. "I expect to go to Westbrook this evening," I said haughtily, if that is the expedition to which you refer. He has told me since that he saw his mistake. His tone changed to one of gentle persuasion. Julia, I wish you would not. There are many reasons to urge against it. In the first place, the evening is fearfully cold and stormy, and you will get no rest to-night. And besides, have you thought how it will appear to absent yourself during a time of special interest, not only from all the meetings of the week, but from this regular Thursday meeting? You have, too, a young lady among your number who last week attended every meeting, and now at the last moment I hear has been persuaded into joining you." "Who is it?" I interrupted. "Carrie Seward. Julia, I would not have had her mind led away at this time for anything. It is a very solemn thing to do." "I didn't ask her to go," I interrupted impatiently. "I didn't even know she was going, and your objections come at a singular time, a few hours before we are ready to start. How could we change our plans now if we wanted to, when we are expected and depended upon? You have known for a week that we are going. Why haven't you interfered before, if you intended to at all?" "I did not know it, Julia," he said gravely. "I knew that some wild scheme of the kind was projected, but I did not know that Mrs. Tyndall was engaged in it, nor that she had drawn you in. I certainly thought that she had more sense." "Thank you," I said loftily. "I drew myself into it, and I am not at all disturbed about it. Do you want me any more? Because I have a great deal to do between this and 6 o'clock." "Yes," he said, beginning to walk the floor in the restless way that I remembered so well as a child. "I want you to give up this scheme, Julia. I entreat it of you. It is a momentous time with us. There are solemn interests at stake. Had you been present at the meetings during this week, you would understand what a strange thing it will appear to have some of our members absent for such a purpose on such a night as this. Besides, there are other reasons. I am sure you have not stopped to think how your mother would look upon your public appearance in such a scene as that in which I saw you the other evening." "I don't know what you mean," I said, coloring violently and speaking angrily. "I mean," he said gravely, "that I am sorry to have a friend of mine take for 5 seconds and in play the degrading and disgraceful position of a miserable heathen woman, a position which Christianity abolishes, and which women speak of, when they are obliged to speak of it at all, with blushes of pain and shame. You are young and innocent, Julia, and the blame of bringing you in such a manner before the public rests upon older heads than yours. But for your sister Esther's sake, I would not have the like occur again." By this time my cheeks were blazing, and I must say, in extenuation of my own conduct, that I had a very vague idea of what he meant. I was both thoughtless and innocent, and had been led on by another, precisely as I have since seen young misses allowing themselves to be led, and I know just how they will feel about it at 20, provided they have not by that time decided not to feel or think at all. The doctor checked the indignant answer that rose to my lips. "There is another point about which I must speak. This morning I received a letter from your mother. She is in a state of terrible anxiety about you. She writes me that she has not heard from you in 4 weeks, and feels certain that you must be ill. She has spent nights of torture, she says, on your account. I immediately telegraphed her that you are well. I thought we ought not to wait to write, for I value a mother too highly to keep her long in such suspense as was evidently hers. But since reading her letter I have been led to fear that I was not doing my duty in regard to you. You must let me ask you some very plain questions, Julia. Are you engaged to Mr. Sayles?" At which question my cheeks, if possible, flamed hotter than before, and I answered with excitement: "Such a question as that you have no right to ask. No one but my mother has any right to question me in that way." "I don't feel certain of that," he answered gently. "In this letter which I have received today, your mother begs me to remember that she trusts her child to my care, and that she expects me to watch over you as earnestly as I would if I were your brother in name as well as in heart. In view of all the apparent circumstances, if I were your brother I should ask you the question which I have just now asked you, and I feel that I must understand this matter before I can reply to your mother's letter." "I wish my mother could remember that I am not a 10-year-old child," I said angrily. "Well, since you demand an answer, I am not engaged to Mr. Sayles, and I haven't the slightest expectation of being. and you can telegraph that to my mother if you think best. Is that satisfactory?" "I don't know whether it is or not," he answered, with grave sternness, "because I hardly see how I can justify such constant attentions as you have received and accepted from him on any other grounds." "You are not called upon to justify them," I said pertly; and as I think of it now, I am almost surprised that he did not box my ears in reply. "I cannot, in the first place, see how you can reconcile it with your conscience, or even with your pride, to receive his marked attentions when you think of Frank Hooper." Curiosity got the better of my pride just then, and I listened eagerly while he continued. "I don't think you can know quite how base his utter desertion of Frank was. They were to have been married in less than 2 months' time, when the great business crash came that involved Mr. Hooper and ruined his fortune, and then it took this Mr. Sayles but a few days to discover that he and Frank were not suited to each other." This story was entirely new to me. It made my cheeks glow again, but I answered with an incredulous smile: "I thought you were proof against gossip, Doctor. If this remarkable history is true, how do you account for the fact that Frank Hooper has twice at least appeared with him in public during the last 3 months?" "I can only account for it by the remembrance that she is a loving, forgiving, infatuated girl," he answered gravely. "I believe I have the history on too good authority to discredit it." "Nevertheless, I discredit it," I answered loftily. "And now, if you have nothing further, I really must go. I have a great deal to do before evening." I moved toward the door as I spoke, but he detained me eagerly. "Julia, let me beg you to think of this matter. I do earnestly hope that you will decide not to go." "I shall decide no such thing," I said angrily. "How absurdly you talk! How can I change it all now when I am pledged to go?" "Very easily. You can have no idea of the severity of the evening. I have heard it suggested several times that the festival would undoubtedly be postponed. Most of their people are from the country, and the country roads will be impassable. You know quite well that if your mother were here she would not permit you to go. But besides all this, if there are really souls at stake, ought you not to be in your place this evening, instead of working against the current?" I stood silent and thoughtful for a moment, then said quickly: "There is no use in talking about it any longer. People can't whirl their plans around as quickly as that. I can go to meeting every evening after this one for a month. There will be nothing in the world to hinder." Then I immediately left the room. Nevertheless, as I closed the door, I almost decided not to go. I was by no means in so reckless and unconcerned a mood as I had chosen to assume. I crossed the hall, revolving plans in my mind for satisfying Mrs. Tyndall with a change of program. "It would not be such an impossible thing to do," I said. "We are only in 2 tableaux after all, and the entire festival does not depend upon them. And if the evening is going to be so stormy, it will certainly justify us in not taking a ride of 3 miles after we leave the station." I was halfway upstairs when Mrs. Tyndall's silvery voice summoned me to the back parlor. She was sunken into the depths of her favorite crimson chair, with an exceedingly listless and inattentive expression on her face, and Dr. Mulford stood near her speaking earnestly. "My dear," she said as I entered, "you are in demand to day. The doctors seem to have you in their keeping. Dr. Mulford wishes to see you." He came toward me at once, holding out his hand and speaking rapidly. "My dear young lady, I have come to make a very earnest request that you would reconsider your plan for the evening, even at this late hour. I did not know of it until very recently. Mrs. Tyndall and yourself are the only professing Christians of the party, and you have some among your number, one in particular, who is treading on a very dangerous ground. She has simply entered into the scheme for the sake of trying to stifle her conscience. I beg that you will not help her in the effort. Besides, we need your help, your moral support. I am confident that there are many souls among us just trembling in the balance, and such a very little thing may turn the scale." "And what about our pledged word, Doctor, and the expectations that are based upon us? You seem to forget these things." He turned eagerly toward her. "I do not, madame. Under ordinary circumstances I should counsel you to be exceedingly careful in regard to breaking an engagement. But this is a special matter. It is the Lord's work. It behooves us to lay aside every possible weight, and be ready for his appearing. My brother Reynolds is pastor of that church, and if you will permit me I will myself explain matters to him. I know him well, and I assure you that he will understand and appreciate the reasons for the change." Mrs. Tyndall smiled quietly. "You gentlemen are the most singular creatures," she said quietly. "You think a word of kindly explanation is all that is necessary to justify one in almost anything. Now, I am not responsible to Reverend Mr. Reynolds, but to a committee of ladies, and I know them better than to disappoint them. My dear, would it not be well for you to commence your preparations? It is growing late. I think the doctor will excuse you." But I lingered for the issue. "I am sorry, doctor, that our going makes any difference. I do not quite understand these times of excitement, you know, and fail to be in sympathy with them. To me it seems so much better to live our religion all the time than to have these periodical and spasmodic fits of it, but then, of course, I have nothing to do with that. As for Carrie Seward, the child came to me last night in the wildest spirits. Your meeting seemed to have afforded her a great fund of amusement, and, by the way, I fear a number of those giddy creatures are deceiving you in the same manner. I should not have asked her to join us had I been aware of your objections, but as it is, you need have no fear. The giddy little thing will be safer with us than she will be frolicking in the prayer meeting." To all of which Dr. Mulford made no sort of reply. He even bowed his adieus without speaking, and immediately went away. "What an abrupt man he is," was Mrs. Tyndall's comment. Chapter 17. Recording by Trisha G.